March 18th, 2015. Longmont, Colorado. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. The air was brisk but promising, the kind of early spring chill that lingers just long enough to remind you winter isn't quite finished. On the quiet cul-de-sac of Dynasty Heights Drive, the home sat modestly, wrapped in the comfort of routine. Nothing unusual stirred. No signs of what was about to unfold. No one would have guessed that a young woman, full-term pregnant, would be crawling up from a basement drenched in blood, whispering for help between jagged breaths. Michelle Wilkins was 26 years old and days away from giving birth to her first child. She had been scrolling through Craigslist when she stumbled upon a post that felt almost serendipitous. A woman named Dynel Lane was giving away baby clothes. The tone of the post was warm, maternal. Lane even included pictures. Tiny pink onesies, bibs embroidered with pastel elephants, a lightly used bassinet. She said she just wanted to help another expectant mother. Michelle responded. They messaged back and forth before setting a time for a pickup. Lane gave her the address. "Come by around noon," she wrote. "I've got a lot you can take." Michelle told her boyfriend she'd be back soon. Just a quick errand. She drove to the small townhouse off of 17th Avenue. The home looked quiet, but lived in. A child's bike leaned on the porch. An American flag hung faded in the sun. Michelle parked her car, stepped out, and knocked on the front door of 1642 Green Place. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she was walking into a trap. Dynel Lane answered the door with a wide smile. Her dark hair framed her face, and beneath her sweatshirt, a pronounced baby bump suggested she was pregnant herself. She invited Michelle in casually. The home was neat. Candles flickered softly. There was a faint smell of vanilla in the air. They chatted easily at first, two mothers swapping stories about due dates, cravings, the anxieties of childbirth. Lane told Michelle she was due just a few days earlier, March 3rd, but the baby was taking its time. She joked about being overdue, said her girls were excited to meet their baby sister. Michelle felt comfortable. The conversation stretched. Lane showed her upstairs, where she had set aside several bags of baby clothes. They sifted through them together. Lane handed Michelle a few items to keep: booties, a newborn hat, a soft blanket. The gesture felt kind, almost too kind. Eventually, Michelle stood up and politely signaled she needed to go. She had errands to run. But as she walked toward the front door, Lane stopped her. "Oh, wait," she said. "I think I have more stuff downstairs. You should take a look." Michelle paused. She didn't want to be rude. "Sure," she said, following her hostess toward the basement door. The basement was dim and quiet. Lane flicked on the light, beckoning her downward. Michelle stepped carefully down the stairs. At the bottom, it was cooler, slightly damp. Boxes were stacked along the wall. A washer and dryer sat humming in the corner. Lane knelt beside one of the bins, rummaging. Michelle stood politely nearby, unsure what she was supposed to be seeing. Then, something changed. Lane turned quickly, her expression no longer friendly, her eyes no longer soft. Michelle started backing toward the stairs. "I really should be going," she said. Lane blocked her path. That's when Michelle felt the first blow. A sharp, stunning pain in her back. "What the hell?" she gasped, turning in confusion. "I think there was a spider," Lane said, her voice clipped. Michelle was stunned. "Did you just hit me?" Lane didn't respond. She lunged. Michelle struggled, her belly making it hard to move quickly. Lane shoved her against the wall and grabbed the hem of her sweater, pulling it up violently. "What are you doing?" Michelle cried. "Stop." Lane forced her toward a small bathroom at the base of the stairs, but Michelle resisted. She twisted her body away and tried to scramble toward the stairs. That's when she saw the lava lamp. It happened so fast, Lane grabbing it by the neck, smashing it against Michelle's head. The world went blurry. Stars, blood, then another blow, and another. Michelle fell. She tried to speak, to scream, but her mouth filled with the taste of metal. Lane whispered something. "If you love me, you'll let me do this." Then pain. The worst pain imaginable. She felt the pressure, the slicing, the sensation of her own body being cut open. Her hands clawed weakly at the air. Then nothing. Hours passed. When Michelle opened her eyes, she was cold, alone. The light in the basement had dimmed. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, on her hands. She had no idea how long she'd been unconscious. She tried to move. Agony. She remembered. She had a phone. She reached for it. Somehow, incredibly, it was still in her jeans pocket. She slid it out with shaking fingers and dialed 911. Her voice was faint. "There's been an attack. I'm in the basement. Please." Dispatchers struggled to understand her at first. Her words slurred, broken. She told them she had been stabbed, that someone took her baby. Officers arrived within minutes. They forced their way into the townhouse and found the trail of blood leading downstairs. At the bottom of the stairs, they found Michelle, pale and barely alive. Her abdomen was split open. She was missing nearly 3 liters of blood, but she was conscious. She was still fighting. Miles away, at Longmont United Hospital, a woman had just arrived in the ER claiming she had given birth at home. She was exhausted, sweating, holding a premature infant wrapped in a blanket. Nurses rushed her inside. The baby was small, barely 3 pounds, and struggling to breathe. The woman gave her name, Dynel Lane. She said the birth had been fast. Too fast. She didn't have time to get to the hospital. Her fiancé was with her, but something didn't add up. She had no birth fluids on her, no tearing, no placental remnants. Her vitals were stable, abnormally so. Then the call came in from dispatch. There had been a home invasion, a stabbing. A woman was en route to the hospital, barely clinging to life, and her baby was missing. Dynel Lane was taken into custody in the hospital hallway. The baby, Michelle's baby, was rushed to the NICU. No one knew if she would survive the night. This was no birth. It was a theft, a crime that would send shockwaves through Colorado and beyond, one that would test the limits of justice and the depths of grief. The world would soon know Michelle Wilkins' name, and they would never forget what Dynel Lane tried to take from her. Not just her child, but her life. Courtrooms aren't made for closure. They're built for facts, evidence, arguments. But when a woman walks into one after nearly being murdered, after having her child cut from her body, the silence in the room shifts. It stiffens. It thickens with something primal. And when Michelle Wilkins took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. It had been nearly a year since that morning in Longmont, Colorado, when Dynel Lane invited Michelle into her home under the pretense of giving away baby clothes. Michelle survived, but she was never the same. Her voice had changed. Her eyes carried something heavy. Still, she told the truth. Slowly, steadily, sometimes choking back tears, sometimes pausing for long stretches, as if the words needed permission to come out. "She told me she was due March 3rd, Michelle said on the stand. "She looked small, but I didn't think anything of it. She just seemed lonely." She explained how Lane closed the front door, how she was led downstairs, how she felt a strike against her back, then another. Then the world started breaking apart. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Michelle described being strangled, slammed against the floor, cut open. She told them about the lava lamp, how its glass tore into her skin, how Dynel had whispered, "If you love me, you'll let me do this." And then darkness. Prosecutors didn't hold back. They played Michelle's 911 call. Even seasoned journalists shifted in their seats as the audio echoed through the room. Michelle's voice was barely audible, weak, broken, but the terror in it was unmistakable. She cut me open. She took my baby." People cried. A juror wiped tears. One of the detectives looked away. Then came the photos. Images of the crime scene. Blood smears down the basement wall. A shattered lava lamp. A bloody towel pressed into a mattress. A maternity bag torn open. Its contents scattered like discarded promises. It looked less like a room and more like a battlefield. One where only one soldier had survived. But when it came time for the defense, they tried a different angle. They didn't deny the violence. They couldn't. Instead, They focused on intention. Dynel Lane, they argued, didn't mean to kill Michelle. She was mentally unwell, desperate, broken by the grief of losing her own child. They painted her as a woman deluded by the dream of motherhood, so consumed by loss that she built a life big enough to live in. This is a woman who has suffered unimaginable pain, her lawyer told the jury. What happened in that basement wasn't premeditated. It was a breakdown, a tragedy, not a murder attempt. But Michelle's survival made that impossible to believe. This was an impulsive act. This was methodical, planned, executed. Investigators have found no searches for how to perform a cesarean section on Lane's laptop or phone. But she had medical training. As a former CNA, she knew enough to mimic the procedure. She knew where to cut. She knew how deep. One ER doctor testified that the incision was so precise it could have been done in an operating room. Another doctor said that Michelle lost nearly half the blood in her body. And yet, Dynel had the presence of mind to clean up the scene, to take a shower, to call her fiancé, to lie and say she'd gone into labor at home. That lie unraveled the moment Dave Ridley took the stand. He was nervous. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. He told the court that Dynel had convinced him she was pregnant, that he'd rubbed her belly, kissed her swollen stomach. He'd listened to heartbeat recordings. He'd helped organize a baby shower. He'd even helped name the baby James. But toward the end, he began to doubt. I told her I wanted to go to the next appointment, he said. I told her she didn't take me. I couldn't stay with her. She said she understood. And 2 days later, she attacked Michelle Wilkins. Then came the most haunting testimony of all. The NICU nurse who received the baby. She described how Dynel arrived at the hospital with blood on her clothes and a newborn in her arms. She claimed the baby had come early, that she hadn't had time to call. But the nurse knew instantly something was wrong. She didn't act like a new mother, she said. She was detached, focused on proving something. She kept insisting the baby was hers. She didn't ask to hold her, didn't ask how she was doing. She just kept saying, tell Dave she's okay. Tell Dave she's ours. The baby, Aurora, was barely 3 pounds. She had no chance. Her little heart stopped within hours. Michelle never got to hold her alive, never heard her cry. She named her Aurora anyway. That name, she later said, came to her in a dream, a flash of light in the dark. It meant dawn, a name for a girl who had never seen the sun. At the end of the prosecution's case, the DA looked the jury in the eye. This was not a woman broken by grief, he said. This was a woman who planned an abduction, who lured an innocent pregnant mother into her home, who carved a child from her womb, who left her to die. If Michelle had not called 911, she would be dead. He paused, then held up a photo. It was Michelle's ID, bloodstained, bent, recovered from the crime scene. This is all she had left when she crawled up those stairs. The defense rested its case quickly. They had no rebuttal strong enough to pierce the truth. Dynel Lane never took the stand. Not once did she apologize. Not once did she explain why. When the jury returned, it took just 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Attempted first-degree murder, first-degree assault, second-degree assault, unlawful termination of pregnancy. The judge looked at Lane and delivered a sentence that echoed through the courtroom like a hammer. 100 years in prison. Dynel Lane showed no emotion. But Michelle Wilkins, she wept, not because she wanted revenge, but because it was finally over outside the courthouse. Michelle gave a brief statement. There will never be a sentence long enough to make this right, but I hope it sends a message. That women like me deserve to be believed. That grief is not an excuse for cruelty, and that love can survive even this. She didn't talk about the attack. She talked about Aurora, about holding her daughter's hand one final time, about choosing to live, even after having everything taken from her. And still, there was one question that no courtroom, no trial, no sentence could ever fully answer. Why? Why did Dynel Lane do it? What part of her broke so completely that she believed this was the only way forward? No one, Not her ex-husbands, not her fiancé, not even the investigators. Ever got a clear answer? Perhaps the answer doesn't exist. Perhaps some horrors simply defy explanation. They eventually let Michelle go home, back to her apartment, back to her neighborhood, back to the place where she and her partner once painted the nursery a soft yellow, where the crib still stood untouched. But she wasn't the same. Not anymore. Something about her had shifted in the space between death and survival. Grief doesn't end when the violence does. It lingers in doorways, in coffee cups, in the way you flinch at the sound of footsteps behind you. Michelle learned this the hard way. There was no instruction manual for recovering from something like this. No hotline to call, no words to neatly wrap around the pain. She began therapy, slowly, hesitantly. At first, she could barely speak. "Sometimes I have dreams where I'm still in the basement," she told her therapist. "But I'm not bleeding. I'm just waiting, and I don't know what for." She'd wake up drenched in sweat, clutching her stomach, gasping as if submerged underwater. On those nights, her boyfriend would sit beside her in silence, unsure of how to help. "It happened to both of us," she said once. "But he lost her too, and I don't know how to hold space for his grief when mine is still flooding the room." Michelle wasn't the only one struggling to process the horror. Back in Longmont, people had started avoiding the house on Green Place, where Dynel Lane lived, where the crime happened. Neighbors stopped walking their dogs past it. Children refused to trick or treat near the front porch. Some claimed the basement light flickered late at night. Others swore the property felt colder than it should have, like the air itself had memory. The property remained vacant for months. A realtor eventually tried to sell it, quietly, discreetly, but word had spread, and no one wanted to live in a house where a woman had been carved open and left to die. In the media, the case gained traction. At first, it was headlines designed for shock. Womb raider sentenced to 100 years. Fake pregnancy ends in grisly attack. But slowly, something shifted. People began talking about Michelle, not just what happened to her, her resilience, her calm strength, her refusal to let the story be framed only as tragedy. She gave interviews, spoke softly, chose her words carefully. "I want people to remember my daughter. Her name was Aurora, and she mattered." What struck most viewers wasn't how angry she was, but how gentle. There was no revenge in her voice, only sorrow, and that made it all the more haunting. But even as Michelle tried to move forward, questions lingered in the background like shadows that wouldn't settle. Had Dynel Lane planned to kill her all along? Investigators believed so. They uncovered a chilling timeline. Months before the attack, Dynel had told friends she was pregnant. She'd hosted a baby shower with jungle-themed cupcakes, a cake that read, "Welcome, James," and gifts stacked beside a decorative bassinet. She'd shown ultrasound photos, which were later traced back to the internet. She posted updates on Facebook about false labor pains, missing due dates, and how her doctor wasn't worried. And when Dave, her fiancé, asked to attend a doctor's appointment, she became evasive, angry, then desperate. The more police dug, the clearer it became. Michelle Wilkins wasn't a random victim. She was targeted. Dynel had reportedly visited a friend's house weeks earlier, asking to meet her pregnant roommate. That roommate wasn't home, so Dynel left. That could have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. She kept searching, and she found Michelle through a Craigslist post offering free baby clothes. That wasn't fate. It was calculated. And when Michelle arrived, kind, polite, unsuspecting, Dynel saw her final chance. But there was one thing Dynel never planned on: Michelle surviving. Investigators were stunned when they arrived at the house and found Michelle still conscious, whispering through blood. The dispatcher, who took the call later, admitted she wept afterward. It was the calmest 911 call I've ever heard, and the most terrifying. Michelle told them where she was, who had hurt her, what happened. She saved her own life with every strained syllable. In the aftermath, Colorado lawmakers realized something horrifying. Under state law at the time, Dynel Lane could not be charged with murder for Aurora's death because the fetus had not drawn a breath outside the womb. That legal gap stunned the public. To Michelle, It felt like a second injustice. She was alive. She was ours. And her life mattered. The state attempted to pass new fetal homicide legislation, but it faced complications with abortion rights and medical definitions. Still, the national debate intensified. Where does personhood begin? What rights does an unborn child have? And how do we protect pregnant people from the unthinkable? Michelle became a reluctant figure in that conversation. She didn't ask to be an activist, but her story forced the country to look at the cracks in the system. In Longmont, life returned to normal on the surface, but beneath it, people changed. Neighbors became more cautious. Expectant mothers became more vigilant. Women began sharing stories of creepy messages, strange encounters, fake nurses, and deceptive kindnesses that could turn dark. There was fear, but also connection, a new layer of awareness, a community of survivors who now recognized each other in ways they hadn't before. As for Dynel Lane, she never offered an explanation, no apology, no insight, no answer to the question Michelle kept asking, why me? During her sentencing, Michelle faced her attacker one last time. Dynel barely looked up, but Michelle did. You tried to silence me, she said, but I am still here, and I will always speak for my daughter. The room was silent. Some jurors cried. Even the judge paused before delivering the sentence. 100 years. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about saying, this mattered. Michelle went home that night to the same apartment, the same yellow nursery. She left the crib up for a while, not because she was in denial, but because it reminded her that love once lived there. She didn't know what healing would look like. She just knew she'd do it anyway, for herself and for Aurora. Long after the court proceedings ended, after the final gavel fell and the cameras stopped rolling, grief stayed behind like a stain that wouldn't lift. Michelle moved to the world like someone underwater. Her voice soft, her movements deliberate. She went to therapy. She spoke at small events. But at night, when everything went quiet, the ghosts came back. Not in the way you'd think. They weren't loud. They didn't scream or wail. They whispered, sometimes in Dynel's voice, sometimes in her own. She told me, if you love me, you'll let me do this. And I couldn't stop hearing it, over and over. Michelle shared this with her therapist during one of their sessions. Her hands trembled as she said it, not from fear, but from exhaustion, a kind of soul-deep fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much. Even in her dreams, the basement returned, but it changed each time. Sometimes it was filled with water. Sometimes Aurora was crying from somewhere she couldn't reach. Once, she dreamed that Dynel was rocking a baby in the dark and smiling like nothing had ever happened. Outside her apartment, the world had moved on, but inside, the air still smelled like antiseptic and lavender lotion, the things a hospital had used after she'd been patched together. Michelle kept Aurora's memory alive in subtle ways. She wore a necklace with a small letter A. She framed the ultrasound photo, the real one, not the fake images Dynel had stolen from the internet. And once a year, on March 18th, she visited the cemetery alone, placing a tiny bouquet of wildflowers on a grave marked only Aurora. She never stayed long, but she always whispered, you mattered. As for Dave, the man Dynel once called her husband, his life had unraveled in slower, quieter ways. At first, he was shocked, then confused, then deeply, irrevocably broken. The man who once rushed home to celebrate newborn, only to find his fiancée covered in blood, holding a stolen baby, had now become a shell of himself. He stopped returning calls from reporters. He left town for a while. Friends say he checked himself into a facility for exhaustion and psychological trauma. But no one pressed too hard. He didn't want pity. He wanted understanding. And that was harder to come by. One friend recalled. He said, I loved her. I didn't know she was lying to me for a year. How do you even begin to unpack that? He hadn't just lost a child. He'd lost a woman he thought he'd spend his life with, and he'd watched her become something unrecognizable, a stranger in the skin of someone he loved. But there were things even the court never revealed, small details that surfaced months later, like the letters. Dynel Lane wrote letters from prison, some to her daughters, some to her mother, and, chillingly, some to Dave. In one of them, she wrote, "I don't remember doing it. I think something broke in me. I just wanted to fix everything, to make it all better, to make you proud." Another one read, "I saw the baby and I thought, finally, something real, something that made all the lies make sense." There was no apology, just justification, like she still believed the pain she caused was some necessary path to redemption. Investigators read through every line, looking for answers, but none came, only questions. Michelle never read the letters. She didn't want to. I've already lived through her story. I don't need to hear her version of it. Instead, she focused on her healing. She took up meditation, journaling. She even volunteered at a support group for women dealing with pregnancy loss. Not because she needed to relive her pain, but because she had survived. And survival, she realized, gave her a strange kind of power. Still, she struggled with something no one warned her about. The anger, not at Dynel, that had calcified into something else, but at people who meant well. "At least you survived," they'd say. "You're so lucky the baby wasn't alive longer. It would have been harder." Time heals all wounds. None of it helped, because no one seemed to understand that surviving a murder attempt doesn't feel like victory. It feels like standing on scorched earth. Alive, yes, but forever changed. One day, Michelle was walking through a bookstore when she passed a section on true crime. On the shelf was a paperback with a red cover, a title that screamed "Womb Thief" in large block letters. On the back, her name. She hadn't approved the book, hadn't even known it existed. She stood there, trembling. Then she picked it up and gently placed it face down on the lowest shelf. Not out of shame, but because she wanted the story told right. Not for shock, but for truth. The truth was this. Dynel Lane didn't just lie about a pregnancy. She didn't just fake a baby's shower or forge ultrasound images. She didn't just attack Michelle or steal Aurora. She manufactured an entire life. And when the lies reached the edge of collapse, she tried to trade another woman's child for her salvation. And she failed, because Michelle lived. And in doing so, she shattered Dynel's narrative. In late 2017, Michelle spoke at a women's conference. It wasn't about the attack. It was about resilience. She stood on stage, her voice calm, her hands steady. "They told me I was a victim, but I am not. I am a witness to my own rebirth." People stood and applauded. Some cried. Some simply nodded, feeling something unnameable stir inside them. Michelle never forgave Dynel. She didn't need to. Forgiveness wasn't part of her healing. Survival was. Truth was. Telling Aurora's story in her own words, that was the final act of defiance. Years from now, people might forget Dynel Lane's name, but they'll remember Michelle Wilkins, not because of what was taken from her, but because of what she chose to give back. Grace, strength, and the courage to speak, even when your voice shakes. Basements have a strange kind of memory. Unlike other rooms in a house, they remain untouched longer. Dust lingers. Shadows settle. Time folds on itself. And for months after the attack, Michelle Wilkins' blood still stained the concrete floor of Dynel Lane's basement, even after multiple forensic cleanings. The room was a tomb, but one detail had been missed. Nearly a year after Dynel's sentencing, when the crime had faded from national headlines and Michelle had begun to piece her life back together, Boulder County investigators received a call from a janitorial contractor assigned to clean out evidence inventory. While organizing boxes at the storage facility, one worker opened a sealed evidence bin marked DL Scene Box 3. Inside, a shattered lava lamp, a plastic tub of stained baby clothes, and something that hadn't been cataloged. A black Sony microcassette recorder. Old, dusty, batteries corroded. It wasn't in the original report. No one remembered seeing it at the scene. But when they popped the new batteries and hit play, the device whirred to life, and a voice crackled through the static. March 17, "I can't sleep. Dave's getting suspicious. I told him I had a cramp and went for a walk, but really, I just sat in the basement for an hour. practicing, just seeing how quiet I could be. The voice was unmistakably Dynel's. Detectives, shaken by the unexpected discovery, sat in silence as they listened to nearly 2 hours of disjointed recordings. The tapes weren't journal entries. They weren't confessions either. They were rehearsals. Dynel had been using the recorder to practice what she would say to Dave, what she'd tell doctors, and, chillingly, what she'd say if someone showed up to stop her. In one disturbing clip, she says, "If I get caught, I'll just cry." People always believe women when they cry, especially when you talk about losing a child. Then laughter, small, nervous, hollow. This tape alone wouldn't change the outcome of the trial. Dynel was already serving 100 years. But for Michelle, it reopened a wound she thought was finally scarring over. Boulder DA's office reached out with the news. "There's something you need to hear," they told her. It's about what she was planning. Michelle agreed to listen, alone. She sat in a small room with headphones on. The tape hissed to life. "I don't think I'll kill her," Dynel's voice echoed. "I just need her baby. That's all. If she doesn't fight, I can keep her. Make her stay here until it's done. Maybe she'll understand." The absurdity of the statement made Michelle go cold. Dynel had convinced herself that Michelle could somehow understand. She'd rewritten the rules of morality to justify the horror. "If you love me, you'll let me do this." It wasn't a fluke. It was a script. Another discovery was made soon after. The notebook. It had been missed during the initial sweep, found behind the dryer during final demolition of the crime scene. It was a slim, spiral-bound journal. The first page read, Plan A, natural home birth. Plan B, emergency love. Inside were fragments, lists of baby supplies, real and imagined, doodles of the baby's name in different handwriting styles, Aurora, Ariana, Ava. Then, buried in the middle, disturbing sketches of anatomical diagrams. Dynel had drawn a rudimentary outline of a woman's body with notations. Incision here. Clamp this. Don't cut too deep. There were no internet searches on her devices because she hadn't needed them. She had studied manually and silently, like she was preparing for surgery, or something worse. For investigators, these discoveries painted a clearer and darker picture of Dynel Lane. She wasn't impulsive. She was methodical. She wasn't delusional. She was determined. And most terrifying of all, she knew exactly what she was doing. Michelle spoke publicly about the tape and notebook in a rare interview later that year. She didn't want to sensationalize it. She wanted to close the door on it. She wanted a child, Michelle said softly. But instead of healing, she chose to steal someone else's life and build her future on top of a grave. Her voice didn't tremble. She looked right into the camera. "I survived her plan, but not everyone does. That's why I'm still speaking, because someone else might not get the chance." There was one more mystery left unsolved. The missing email. A digital forensic expert combing through Dynel's old laptop found traces of a draft never sent. It was titled to Michelle's family. Its contents were corrupted, never fully recovered, but fragments remained. "I don't hate her. She was chosen. You wouldn't understand. No one will ever know what the full message said." But even in its broken form, it was chilling. Dynel believed she had a right to what she took. She believed Michelle was meant to be part of her plan. In a way, this made Michelle's survival all the more powerful, because she refused to play the part Dynel had written for her. She didn't just escape a crime. She tore down the narrative, one breath, one therapy session, one courtroom appearance at a time. Today, the basement no longer exists. The house has since been sold and gutted. New owners tried to rent it, but tenants left abruptly. One claimed they could still smell bleach in the lower level. Another said she felt someone watching her from the dark. Whether those claims were real or not doesn't matter, because for those who know the truth, the real horror never lived in the walls. It lived in the silence, the practice lies, the carefully sharpened fantasy of a woman willing to destroy life to fabricate her own. There's a kind of quiet that follows a crime like this. Not silence, but something heavier. something that lingers in courtrooms and echoes in hallways, a tension that refuses to let the truth rest, even when the verdict has already been delivered. For Michelle Wilkins, survival didn't bring peace. It brought questions. Questions no sentence could answer. Questions no apology could mend. What makes a woman like Dynel Lane build a lie so elaborate she's willing to carve it into someone else's body? Psychologists later reviewed Dynel's behavior in detail. Though she was never officially diagnosed with a delusional disorder, experts pointed to signs of factitious disorder, specifically Munchausen syndrome by proxy, with a rare variant. Instead of harming her own child for attention, Dynel created a phantom pregnancy to anchor her relationship and regain control of her life. She wasn't hallucinating. She was pretending. Obsessively, convincingly, completely, and over time, she began believing her own performance. This wasn't about motherhood. It was about identity. In the early 2000s, Dynel had been a certified nursing assistant, an underpaid, overlooked profession often tasked with high-emotion care. She had held life in her hands before. She had wiped tears, dressed wounds. But her certification had expired. Her career unraveled, and her relationships followed. She remarried, moved towns, tried to start fresh. Then her son drowned, a tragedy that shattered what little control she had left. In the aftermath, those around her described a new Dynel, withdrawn, secretive, obsessed with fertility forums and parenting blogs. Years later, when she met Dave and learned he'd never had a child of his own, she saw it. Her chance, her redemption, her leverage. Dynel's plan, if it can be called that, wasn't born overnight. She faked doctor appointments for nearly a year. She hosted a baby shower, posted ultrasound photos pulled from Google, wore a prosthetic belly around her teenage daughters. And she studied, not just anatomy, she studied Michelle Wilkins. Michelle, whose Craigslist post offered free baby clothes. Michelle, who was 7 months pregnant with a baby girl. Alone, open, kind, perfect. It's hard to explain just how dangerous someone like Dynel can be, because she does it with a mask of evil. She wears a smile, offers a gift, says, "Come inside, it's warm here." Then she waits until your guard is down, until your back is turned, until you're too far from the stairs to run. Michelle's final testimony was devastating, not in volume, not in anger, but in composure. She sat before the court, voice steady, recounting the moment Dynel whispered, "If you love me, you'll let me do this." And she described what came next: the stabbing, the cold blade, the sound of a child being taken before she ever had the chance to cry. Then her voice cracked. "You didn't just try to take my baby. You tried to erase me." The courtroom went still. Even the judge lowered his eyes. The jury deliberated for just a few hours. They found Dynel Lane guilty on all counts: attempted first-degree murder, unlawful termination of pregnancy, and multiple counts of assault with a deadly weapon. The sentencing was swift. 100 years in prison. No parole. No leniency. Not for someone who researched where to cut. Not for someone who waited until her partner's deadline, March 18th, to make her move. Not for someone who still, to this day, has never apologized to Michelle Wilkins. Aurora, the baby Michelle named after the Northern Lights, survived only a few minutes. Born too early, too fragile, too brutalized by the method of her arrival. But in that short moment, Michelle was allowed to hold her, to whisper a name, to say hello, to say goodbye. Today, Michelle is an advocate for survivors of violent crime. She doesn't call herself a hero. She doesn't capitalize on pain. She just speaks. "I lived through a nightmare I didn't choose," she once told a group of students. "But I got to choose what happened next. I chose to heal." The scars remain, both emotional and physical, but she wears them with quiet strength because she understands something most people never will: that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they invite you in and offer a gift. Sometimes they smile first. As for Dynel Lane, she's still incarcerated at the Denver Women's Correctional Facility. In her time there, she's requested therapy, access to religious study and been cited multiple times for manipulation of staff. She hasn't spoken publicly since her sentencing, and perhaps it's better that way, because the echoes of her crime are loud enough. We tell stories like this not to exploit trauma, but to remember what people are capable of, to remember the lives that were almost erased, and the ones that endured anyway. If this case moved you, disturbed you, or stayed with you in any way, consider subscribing to our channel. We uncover the stories that others forget, the ones buried beneath headlines and lost to time. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. And sometimes, remembering is the only justice left. Subscribe now, because behind every crime there's a name, a family, a truth, and we won't let them fade.